Last week I was doing some research, looking for some recent Bigfoot sightings to cover, as you know I love covering the subject. And while I was reading an article, I came across a story about a Bigfoot being hit by a train in the late 1800s, and this is one fascinating story. But before I get into that, I want to go over a Yeti case that I've been wanting to cover for some time now. A couple of years ago, the Indian Army, while on an expedition in the Himalayas, came across some huge tracks that they believe came from a Yeti. One day while these soldiers were exploring, probably making sure their borders were being respected in these remote areas, came across some massive tracks. They had never seen tracks like this before, so they decided to stop what they were doing and measure them. And these tracks measured 32 inches long by 15 inches wide, which is massive, and would be about the right size of a Yeti if one was indeed 8 or 9 feet tall. Now these soldiers reported this right away, as this was odd, and I'm sure they knew about the legends of the Yeti. Then not too long after this discovery, these photos went viral on social media. Even a spokesperson for the Indian military stated that the photographs they took had been passed on to the scientific community for further analysis. And as of yet, I haven't heard any official updates, but most believe that it was just from a bear. But wouldn't these trained soldiers that live and work in this region know a bear track when they see it? There was another famous case that happened in 1951 when Western explorers were looking for a path or some way to climb Mount Everest. While on their journey, they came across some large, strange-looking tracks, so they decided to take some pictures. And when they finally made it back home from this expedition, they told the world about these mysterious-looking tracks, and this time they had the photos to prove it. And not too long after, this story was published in almost every single Western newspaper, making the Yeti famous worldwide. Now today, these tracks still remain a mystery, but some believe that they were made by a native. Sometimes natives of this region can suffer from a rare deformity that affects their feet. Some remain skeptical of this theory, as why would one walk out in the middle of nowhere with no shoes or feet coverings? But it is said that these natives with this deformity can walk barefoot in the snow for miles without getting any frostbite, which is extremely fascinating. But this couldn't explain what the Indian explorers found, as those tracks were much bigger. Now the other story I wanted to cover today happened in North America in the late 1800s. A cryptozoologist, Scott White, from the International Bigfoot Society, once spoke to a woman named Rita Swift. Rita remembered a story her grandfather once told her when she was young. Her grandfather George was an engineer. He worked on a train that ran along the US-Canadian border. And one night while passing through a thick forested area far away from civilization, their train hit something big. Something so big that it damaged the cowcatcher. A cowcatcher is a device placed at the front of the train. It helps protect it from damage or from being derailed. Most animals wouldn't be big enough to actually damage a cowcatcher, so this animal must have been massive. At first they thought maybe a giant moose was to blame, but when they went outside with their lanterns, they noticed that there was a terrible smell in the air. Then they saw a giant ape-like creature hung up on the cowcatcher, and this thing was massive. They had no idea that there were animals like this that lived in the woods. Remember, this was in the late 1800s, and no one really knew about the legends of Sasquatch just yet. Now it took almost the whole crew to lift this thing up so they could place it into an open flat cart. And after they finally laid it down, they examined it. And compared to a gorilla, there were some differences, especially in the face. It was more like a giant hairy human than a gorilla. Now during this time, one of the crew members spotted Native Americans sneaking around in the forest. So the crew, they got a little nervous, as it took around 2 hours to repair the cowcatcher. And when they were finally done, they went back to go check on their hairy friend. But it was gone. Now they believed that the natives must have took it. And shortly after, they found their tracks, and it looked like they dragged this massive beast back into the forest. And while they were following the natives' tracks, they had their hands over their noses as they could still smell it. Then they believed that the natives dragged this Bigfoot across a stream that was close to the railway tracks. And at this time, they decided to just let it be. But before they went back to the train, they wanted to wash themselves in the water because they smelled really bad. And after this incident, they believed that whatever this was had to have been something that ran away from the circus. The natives must have saw it roaming in the woods and decided to track it and capture it. But while it was running away from the natives, sadly, it got hit by the train. Now at this time in the late 1800s, there were still large animals being discovered all throughout the world. It was a very interesting time, just full of new amazing technologies as well as discoveries. Now Rita stated that her grandpa was not one to lie. He was one of those tough, honest, hard-working old-timers that sadly really don't exist in today's world, as back then life was a lot tougher. You could get eaten by a bear while just trying to get to the bathroom. Now one thing I was curious about when making this video is, when did Western zoologists discover the gorilla? Could you imagine coming face to face with a gorilla and not knowing that these creatures exist? That would be quite terrifying. And the mountain gorilla, I believe, was not officially discovered until 1902. The African locals told Western explorers for decades, if not centuries, about these massive, majestic creatures. But we didn't believe them. We thought it was just folklore. That is, until we actually saw them. So if native peoples tells you about a creature that they believe exists, we should not be so quick to dismiss it. There still might be some large animals like the mountain gorilla just waiting to be discovered. Until next time, this is Paranormal Junkie. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned.